In studying Seamus Heaney's punishment, we'll be considering the central poetic images, explore the language in detail, study how precise meaning is crafted in the literary language, notice how pronouns reflect the conflict and shift in the focus, reflect on the use of cultural and contextual references, deconstruct and understand the nature of the narrative that is being recounted, and explore the creation of poetic voice and viewpoint. Look at the two pictures here. What links these pictures? How do we view them? How do you see or judge the images that are in front of you? And in what ways does the context affect our view? Do we see them as similar in that they are both portrayals of dead men? Is the one on the left seen to be more valid or true as it is an artifact, a preserved corpse, photographed rather than the stylized painting on the right? Does how we represent a death affect how we value it? And does death in its portrayal reflect our ideological viewpoint and our beliefs? Let's consider another image. If we look at a cross, do we see it as a symbol of a blessing or of good luck? Is it a piece of jewelry? Or is it a symbol used in religious ritual? Most forget that its initial significance was a brutal act of execution, used as a warning to others, to display the consequences of some transgression or crime. What is significant in our culture can sometimes obscure the original meaning and the importance of the thing itself. The signifier has been appropriated for new meanings and becomes a metaphor. If we delve into the past, often we explore the remains of that past and place on it modern values or new attitudes to the things we see in the past. But if we dig deeper, what is buried underground? What lies hidden? What stones can be unearthed? What stories will they tell? In Punishment, Seamus Heaney explores aspects of the past, but appropriates the ideas he has and contemplates, metaphorically, modern places. His consideration is a contemporary context, creating metaphor to offer some intimation on how human beings punish and execute those we consider to be guilty. The poem Punishment builds on ideas initiated in Bogland to do with unearthing, and then explored in The Tollen Man and other poems reflecting on bog culture. Heaney's interest in the bog people has been explored in 8 of his poems, the bog poems: The Tollen Man, Nerthus, Come to the Bower, Bog Queen, The Growlbowler Man, Punishment, Kinship, and Strange Fruit. He read about the bodies in a work of archaeology, P.V. Glob's The Bog People, was published in Danish in 1965 and then translated into English in 1969. He was moved by Glob's lyrical descriptions of the sometimes beautifully preserved Iron Age bodies that turned up from time to time in the peat bogs of northwestern Europe. He was intrigued by the archaeologists' recourse to theories of ritual human sacrifice in order to explain their presence in the bogs. They are not skeletal remains. They have flesh on their bones, and that flesh bears the marks of their living and their dying. They have hair and beard stubble, and the faces with expressions we think we recognize. They have stomachs that still contain the grains and seeds and plants they ate as their last meal. In a word, with their peculiar capacity to compress time, bog bodies speak of a life anchored in an everyday that was then, but is also now. To an extraordinary degree, bog bodies allow us to see time. The punishments may have been a religious sacrifice to bless the harvest. It may have been an execution for a crime. Its original meaning is very much a matter of interpretation. Heaney said that information and speculation were vital elements when writing his bog poems.
Punishment. I can feel the tug of the halter at the nape of her neck, the wind on her naked front. It blows her nipples to amber beads. It shakes the frail rigging of her ribs. I can see her drowned body in the bog, the weighing stone, the floating rods and boughs, under which at first she was a barked sapling that is dug up, oak bone, brain-firkin, her shaved head like a stubble of black corn, her blindfold a soiled bandage, her noose a ring to store the memories of love. Little adulteress, before they punished you, you were flaxen-haired, undernourished, and your tar-black face was beautiful. My poor scapegoat, I almost love you, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. I am the artful voyeur of your brain's exposed and darkened combs, your muscles webbing, and all your numbered bones. I, who have stood dumb when your betraying sisters, called in tar, wept by the railings, who would connive in civilized outrage, yet understand the exact and tribal, intimate revenge.
Heaney paints a picture of a female bog body. Preserved for over 1,000 years, the details of her body are closely and intimately drawn. These pictures show different bog bodies to convey the amazing detail that is seen in their remains. But do we see these as corpses or objects of anthropological interest? Do we objectify and exploit the victims for our own interest? Heaney wrote Punishment in 1972, and it's from part of his North collection. He had moved to live in the south of Ireland in Wicklow, and he'd become a freelance writer, producing some programmes for the BBC and writing to reflect on the deteriorating situation of Northern Ireland, which had also witnessed the terrible killings of Bloody Sunday and its repercussions. Heaney told Driscoll in Stepping Stones that he was writing very carefully about the situation, being alert to it, and not necessarily addressing it directly. He said, "I was proceeding carefully and cautiously, minding my mouth, but in minding it, I hope, for the right reasons." At the time of writing, the IRA was punishing girls and young women who fraternized or dated British soldiers, tarring and feathering them and tying them to lampposts in the street as a warning to others. Martha Doherty's story is just one case. This picture, showing another bogman, has been unearthed and presented. In what ways do we see the remains of bog people? Even by using the epithet bog people, we objectify them as unearthed anthropological finds. We can only begin to see them as people if we speculate and understand or empathize with them as victims. In what way does Heaney use and exploit the woman at the center of the poem? Read the poem again, and on a clean copy of it, underline any key words that help you to explore this relationship between the poet, the persona, and the woman he addresses. Heaney shifts between a speculation and empathy for the victim, the executed girl or woman who has been unearthed, and a self-aware objectification of her remains. There is a tension between wanting to imagine her state, her death, and her experience, to empathize with what she went through over 1,000 years before, and his self-conscious recreation of her identity and persona for his own ends, as the subject matter of the poem. The words in green on this slide tend to reflect Heaney's desire to empathize and acknowledge her beauty as a person, as a young woman. I can feel, I can see, I almost love you. But the highlighting in green also incorporates more figurative language, where Heaney defines her in positive words to beautify her. The amber beads, frail rigging, a barked sapling, like a stubble of black corn, a soiled bandage, a noose ring. The image of amber, the solidified resin of trees, formed into semi-precious stones, objectifies her as a thing of beauty, to be observed, treasured. And the metaphor of the rigging poetically defines her ribs, but obscures her poor physical condition. Did she die undernourished? And the image of the bark sapling conveys how she was stripped, and so young, in more euphemistic language. Similarly, the comparison to stubble of black corn uses the farming simile to convey her agricultural context. The soiled bandage image is perhaps more complex. Is it simply a remnant of the blindfold used in her execution, a punishment to deny women and subjugate them? If so, does it not also remind us of the blood of menstrual cloths, and how this poor young woman is being killed before she can live and have children and enjoy life? In 1970, Yoko Ono had appeared on primetime television wearing a menstrual cloth and conveying a very similar metaphor about the subjugation of women. Heaney seems to see the victim as a woman, brutalized and destroyed by her culture, blinded and exploited by men. Similarly, the metaphor of the ring defines the shape of her noose, but for contemporary readers, at least, it suggests she will be denied a future life with a man and a husband to love, and the romantic memories of love. Other positive images in green here define her as flaxen-haired, beautify, and a poor scapegoat, presenting her as a clear victim. He says, I almost love you, and the adverb almost carefully resists a full declaration, as if his empathy is too powerful for him to really make this commitment. He acknowledges not simply her head, but the intelligence of her brains, and he mentions her numbered bones. The reference to little adulteress evokes the biblical ideas of sin and punishment. The punishment for adultery in the past was stoning. Leviticus chapter 20 verse 10 says, the adulteress shall surely be put to death. And yet it is this particular teaching that Jesus directly challenged in John 8. The adulteress was to be stoned, and yet the man released. The hypocrisy of the judgment is challenged in the narrative. Jesus says, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. The implicit moral message resonates with the word adulteress, and Heaney's compassion for the victims in his own society. Similarly, she is a scapegoat, another biblical image, in which the sins of the community and society are loaded on the one executed at sacrifice. Metaphorically, the societies in the poem use the women to execute and take out the revenges, or the poor, for the poor and the frail and the weak. They become the victims of bigger conflicts, just as the women in Northern Ireland. More biblical ideas resonate with the omniscient voice of the poet. Just as Christ recites Psalm 22 on the cross and knows and may tell or number the count of every one of his bones, he is ultimately rejected by God. In a similar way, the victim, the woman's bones, are numbered and known by the scientists. She is objectified as an artifact, a thing, a symbol. Yet Heaney sees beyond the numbers to see the woman who inhabited and lived in those bones. If you look at the screen here, the words highlighted in blue represent the woman in a more objective way by labeling her body as a thing or a composite of things. The nape of her neck, her naked front, her ribs, her drowned body, dug up oak bone, brain-firkin, her shaved head. These portray her in purely physical terms and exploit her bodily image. She is like an exposed being, a head like a small barrel, shaved, possibly because the hair is rotten at the time, but also evoking images of the shaved heads of adulteresses or traitors, reminiscent of World War I and II. These pictures from World War II show what was done to women who collaborated with the Nazis. They were often shaved, tarred, and paraded in the streets of Europe. Heaney's use of the metaphor of the voyeur in I am the artful voyeur reminds us that he, and by extension we, as readers, are contemplating her, viewing her, and imagining her. She is the subject of the poem whom he exploits for his own purposes. As such, there is a recognition of that and some unease and guilt. At the end of the poem, I've highlighted the shift in focus in yellow. Heaney steps back from the subject of the girl and now reflects and comments. He recognizes that he watches her. He draws a link with the contemporary equivalents, the betraying sisters in Northern Ireland, who were tarred and feathered for dating the enemy, the British soldiers. Notice too the link from the cooled-in tar of the Irish women to the tar-black face of the victim from the bog body. I, who have stood dumb when your betraying sisters, cooled in tar, wept by the railings, who would connive in civilized outrage, yet understand the exact and tribal, intimate revenge. But the revenge killings were on both sides, and another victim was Anne Ogilby, who was killed in front of her children. At the end, then, we discover Heaney's careful minding his mouth. On the one hand, there is his outrage at the humanity shown to the women, treated so barbarically in this way. And yet he has done nothing in Northern Ireland to speak up for contemporary victims. And he fully understands, too, the intimate revenge, as he calls it, of wanting to assert justice for the disloyalty to the tribe. The powerful and conflicting emotions of empathy and outrage are the dramatic tension at the heart of the text, as Heaney observes. His silence in Northern Ireland, though, finds voice in this poem, in the speculative metaphor of the bog girl who allows him to voice his finer sentiments. If we look just at the pronouns of the text now, we can see how the first person narrative voice objectifies the dead girl, describing her. It is a third person feminine possessive pronoun that lists all she is: her neck, her naked front, her nipples, her ribs, her body, her head, and so forth. Halfway through, however, Heaney becomes more intimate by adopting a direct voice to address her. He uses the second person pronouns you and your with 8 references, and directly he shows his empathetic stance and a desire to do much more than see her as simply an artifact. Similarly, the use of the first person pronouns towards the second half reveals Heaney's particular point of view and his response to what he sees and observes. The first person possessive, my poor scapegoat, claims that closer relationship with the dead girl. And then the very personal, I almost love you, I know, I am the artful voyeur, I who have stood dumb. And by seeing her being positioned in front of the artifact of the girl, he is forced to confront how he sees that parallel in his own society, and how he has done nothing to confront his moral responsibility for the killings, for the revenge. To explore the language in more detail, the first stanza has an interplay of short vowels, as in tug, and the more empathetic longer vowels of feel, halter, nape, and naked, as he imagines the abuse she has suffered. The enjambement of the lines makes us feel tugged to the second line, like a harsher plosive with tug, nape, and neck. They evoke the violence that stops with the brutal caesura, like the tug on her neck. The consonants of nape and naked, as well as the T's in tug, halter, and front, unite the sense of stanza 1 with harsher plosives layering the sense of the punishment. And the second stanza cruelly evokes her sensual and sexual beauty. It's erotically charged as the wind blows on her, but the sensuality of this is shattered in the abuse she suffers, reminding us of Heaney's ambivalent view and the representation of who and what she is. In the next 3 stanzas, we see a similar interplay of the short vowels and consonants and words relating to the remains, the body in the bog, the rods, she who is dug up, and the head, simply a stubble of black. In contrast, the reflective words are more contemplative with longer vowels. See her drowned, a waiting stone, the oak bone, brain-firkin. And the figurative language is often more thoughtful and considered. In these stanzas, notice the same pattern. For example, in Little Adulteress, that depicts her with the rapid short vowels, as does flaxen, undernourished. These contrast with the empathetic my poor scapegoat, and even his own definition as the artful voyeur. Running through these stanzas, there is a use of sibilants too, on adulteress, flaxen, face, scapegoat, that leads up to the stones of silence, that Heaney metaphorically throws, not by calling out to help his fellow countrywomen. Even the fricative of the memories is evoked, later in the stones, as Heaney imagines the woman victim and the past united to contemporary victims. The final 3 stanzas resonate with phonetic tension. The fricatives return with brains, muscles, bones, sisters, and civilized, adding the reverberating consequences of doing or not doing something in a politically hostile state. And the nasal in numbered is linked to his standing dumb. The tension is echoed also in the affricates at the end of the lines which rhyme in outrage and revenge. Finally, the tension is summed up in Heaney's use of the oxymoron, civilized outrage, and its companion antithesis in intimate revenge, where the desire to be sensitive and moral is conflicted with the passionate outpouring and the strength of feeling about what the woman has done. In her critical work on Heaney, Helen Wendler wrote of punishment, saying, Heaney's archaeology of persons becomes an anthropology of the present. Dig however deep, the person who rises to the surface is one you recognize from your own life. The situations of the past are replicated at the railings of Belfast. This cast of the imagination in which the present, the tribal abuse of betraying women, makes the past, the Winderby girl, suddenly relevant, and in which the past, the bog body, makes the present, Heaney's own self-admitted complicity in the abuse, unignorable, and is one for which Heaney has been condemned. But no poem is a poem unless, as Yeats said, it is about a quarrel with oneself. If Heaney had no ambivalence about the fraternizing women and their abusers, he would not have been moved to write the poem.